Hi, and welcome to another episode of Facebook Live with ORVIS. And today I've been asked to talk about Tom's favorite fall flies. So I am your host today, Tom Rosenbauer. I've been with ORVIS for 42 and a half years. So I've seen some changes here. And I love to fly fish. I love to trout fish, I love to saltwater fish, I love to bass fish, I sometimes love to steelhead fish. But today we're going to talk about trout flies and Tom's favorite fall flies. And I just arbitrarily picked 8 trout flies. And you're going to disagree with me, and there's going to be lots of what about. I don't want to hear your whatabouts. This is my list. So we're going to talk about my list today. Your whatabouts will probably work just fine, but these are my whatabouts. So anyway, without further ado, let's talk about fall trout fishing. So one of the things you're going to probably encounter are some large aggressive fish. Brown trout and brook trout are not necessarily spawning yet, but they're moving around, they're shuffling around, they're moving up toward the headwaters, they're moving into areas where they're going to spawn. So they're doing some migrations. In some cases it's a short migration, in other cases it can be miles and miles. But they're not going to be feeding as much, but they're going to be aggressive, they're going to be territorial, they want to get stuff out of their way. They want, when they're spawning, they don't want bait fish and crayfish and stuff stealing their eggs, so they start to get aggressive. So let's start with the biggest fly. You want something big and obnoxious and maybe bright, maybe not. Color, who knows if color is important in streamers. But this is articulated fly called Lynchs Double D, down and dirty. And it's a favorite of many people here on the ORVIS staff, particularly when there are large brown trout around. It works all season long, but it's a good big streamer to throw in the fall if you know there's some large aggressive brown trout around. It has a deer hair head with it, but it's epoxied and it's slanted so that when you pull this thing through the water, much like the old Dahlberg diver, it dives and then it will ride up a little bit with the deer hair head after you stop pulling on it. So most people use this with a sinking line or with a sink tip line, or what we typically do, makes it a lot easier, is you just take a high density, super high density, super fast sink rate poly leader, and we put it on the end of our floating line, so it makes a sink tip. You don't have to switch lines. You can just put this sinking poly leader on the end, and then 3 to 4 feet of a heavy tippet. Might be 1x, might be 2x. It could be as heavy as 20 pound if you put it on with a loop knot. You don't need to worry about light tippets, and you don't want light tippets when throwing something big like this. So that's the big obnoxious fly. You can pick your own big obnoxious fly if you want. This is just one of my favorites, the down and dirty. Okay. I think when you're streamer fishing in the fall, you also want something. Sometimes the fish won't eat that big streamer. They might chase it, but they won't take it. Sometimes, when you're talking a little bit smaller fish, this is just too much of a mouthful. So I think you need some sort of conventional, more traditional streamer. And this one happens to be a Conehead Marabou muddler. So it makes a lot of disturbance in the water because of that deer hair collar, but it's got a heavy metal cone for the head, so it sinks pretty well. And you can fish this thing on a floating line if you want, or on a sinking sink tip. Depends on how deep the water is. If the water is only 2 to 3 feet deep, or even 4 feet deep, you can probably get away with just using a floating line. If it's very deep or very fast, you might want to use a sink tip, full sink, or again that super fast sinking poly leader. So this one happens to be yellow. I like yellow in the fall. Brown trout seem to respond to yellow really well, and so do brook trout. But you might also try a black one, and you might also try a white one. So, yellow is one of my favorites in the fall. So I don't go anywhere without some sort of smaller, more traditional yellow streamer that sinks very quickly. So that's the streamer game. My belief is if they're going to eat a streamer at all, they're going to eat almost any pattern. They're just out there looking for something to grab, a piece of meat. And yeah, maybe sometimes color makes a difference. I'm not so sure it does. But have a couple streamers. Have a big one. Have a little bit smaller one. All right. So, dry fly fishing. Dry fly fishing is often not great in the fall, but you can hit the rare day when the dry fly fishing is spectacular. Typically, well, not typically. Sometimes it's good on a kind of a calm, warm, still day, and can also be good on a raw, rainy, or even snowy day because insects will often hatch when the light levels are low. So there's two things you're going to most likely see on the water hatching in the fall. One is a midge. Midges are common in most trout streams. They're especially common in tailwaters and spring creeks. And midges hatch all year long. And they can be quite abundant in the fall. And one of my favorite midge dry imitations when the fish are either eating adult midges or emerging midges, midge pupae that are emerging at the surface, is a Griffis Snap. I'll bring this a little closer so you can see the Griffis Snap. Fairly simple fly. It's got peacock curl and palmered grizzly body. And then some people put a little crystal flash for the tail. This one happens to have a crystal flash tail. So it looks like an emerging midge. Or the crystal flash could maybe imitate the wings of the adult midge. Anyway, Griffis Snap's a great fly. It also works for, it'll work when there's small mayflies hatching. It's not an exact imitation, but I've caught lots of fish when on Griffis Snap when trout were eating small mayflies or even small caddisflies. So it's just a great generic fly, and it's very good in the fall. That's one dry fly. The second dry fly is an olive mayfly imitation. So this one is a olive sparkle dun, size 18. You are most likely, regardless of where you fish, if you fish a lot in the fall, you're going to encounter some hatches of olive mayflies. They might be as big as a size 18. They could be as small as a 24 or a 26. There are a number of different species of little olive mayflies that hatch in the fall, and they can provide some terrific fishing. I'm about to head to the Missouri River for a little fishing, and I'm hoping to encounter hatches of these olive mayflies. It's typically very good this time of year, and I'm hoping it happens. So, but we see these little olives in our streams in Vermont. You see them on the Delaware in New York. You see them in Michigan. You see them on the Farmington in Connecticut. You see them all over the place. So have some sort of olive mayfly in a size 18, 20, 22, 24 if you dare. Sometimes they're pretty tiny. And whatever olive mayfly you pick, you might not like the sparkle dun. This happens to be my favorite because it imitates both an adult and an emerger. But there are lots of different olive mayfly imitations, and they're all pretty good. This one just happens to be my favorite. And these are my flies. So these are my picks. So I get to pick the one I like best. Excuse me, a little allergies today. I apologize. Then you need some nymphs. Nymph fishing is probably going to be your best friend in the fall. It'll be consistently day in and day out your most productive way of fishing. And lots of nymphs will work in the fall. Generally, you're going to want to be on the smaller side for your nymphs because there are a lot of midges out there. There are a lot of little mayflies, small caddisflies, and small crustaceans like sowbugs and scuds. I'm going to show you 4 nymphs that I would pick this time of year. The first one is called the killer bug, a very simple fly. It's basically yarn on a hook. Some people put a wire rib on it, but it's basically a piece of yarn on a hook. and sometimes simple flies work fairly well. What happens in the fall is that in streams with a lot of aquatic vegetation, spring creeks and tailwaters, that vegetation starts to break up in the fall. And these guys live in that vegetation, and they either get dislodged or they die because they got no more habitat anymore. And there's a lot of them. There's a lot of them drifting in the water, and the trout jump on them. They love them. They're full of fat and protein. They're very nutritious, and trout will eat them. So have some kind of scud or sow bug imitation. Might not be the killer bug. This happens to be my favorite because it's really easy to tie, really simple, sinks well, doesn't have a lot of flash. I don't always like a lot of flash on my nymphs, but the killer bug is a great fly. It's an old pattern. It's an old English pattern from, I think, the 1940s or the 1950s, developed by the same guy that developed the pheasant tail nymph, and you know how deadly the pheasant tail nymph is, which is one I forgot, but I forgot to include the pheasant tail nymph. Never go anywhere without a pheasant tail nymph, so maybe we'll have 9 of them. And then you're going to want some sort of small nymph to imitate those midge larvae and pupae and the small mayflies. One of the best, and again, a very, get that a little closer, a very generic bug is the zebra midge. Simple fly, a bead, some thread, and some wire. Sinks well, looks like a lot of different stuff, and it's a great generic nymph. You know, maybe fish a bigger nymph and then have this zebra midge as your dropper. But it's good everywhere. It works everywhere in the country, and particularly in the fall. It's an excellent fly. So have some zebra midges with you, and then I'd want a couple of kind of generic mayfly imitations. And I would probably have them smaller than the ones I'm going to show you here. I brought bigger ones today just because they'll show up a little bit better on camera. So one of them is a hotspot pheasant tail. So I did actually include a pheasant tail. This is a jig fly. So when it rides along the bottom, you're much less likely to hang up. It's tied on a jig hook and it rides upside down. So much less likely to snag. It's barbless, so it's easy to get the hook out of the fish. And it combines really a hare's ear nymph with a pheasant tail nymph, and then it has a little hot spot. Sometimes orange, sometimes purple, sometimes pink, whatever, yellow. But that hot spot, the nymph has a little sparkle. The hot spot seems to key fish in on the fly. And it just works really well. So this is kind of a Euro nymphing or tight line nymphing fly, but you can use the jig flies on dry dropper or with indicators or in a tight line Euro nymphing scenario. I use them all the time, always. It just works really well, and they snag less, so you lose fewer of them on the bottom. And then I would have one more jig. One more jig fly, because I really like jig flies. This one is called a tonguehead quill. God, I forgot the name of it. Tonguehead quill or something like that. Tonguehead jig quill. If you search on it, you'll find it. It's similar to that hotspot pheasant tail, but it has a little bit skinnier body. Some of the mayflies are skinnier. I'll show you both of these together. This is the hotspot pheasant tail, and this is the tonguehead jig quill. Sometimes a more slender body, sinks a little quicker, and is more effective. So I'd have two different profiles of mayfly nymph. And so those are my recommendations. I just invented a new word. Those are my recommendations for 8 flies for trout in the fall that will work almost anywhere in North America and then in South America next spring, which is fall down there. Work down there as well. So, just about anywhere in the world, these flies will work this time of year. That's all I had to say, and we'll see if we have any questions for Tom.
Mike's asking your thoughts on pumpkin caddis on the bat and gill.
Mike is asking my thoughts on pumpkin caddis on the bat and kill. So there's a big caddis fly. It's called the October caddis in other parts of the country, and it's pretty common. It's probably one of the biggest caddis flies I've ever seen. It comes from the stick caddis, the ones that crawl along the bottom and make their cases from sticks and stuff. Usually lives in slower water. I have never ever seen a trout eat a pumpkin caddis, adult. They probably do. It's certainly not something that I would run out and look for a hatch of. I might throw a dry fly that looks like a pumpkin caddis if I was blind fishing with a nymph that looks like a big case caddis, but it's not a hatch. In my experience, it's not a hatch on the bat and kill that is of any consequence. I think they hatch at night. I'm not so sure that they don't hatch out of the water. I know they're abundant. I get lots of them on the screens and in my house in the fall. I live on another little trout stream not too far from the bat and kill. So they're around, and it might pay to imitate them, but it's not. I'd go to one of these flies before I'd go to a October caddis imitation.
Don't have any other questions.
Don't have any other questions?
Let's give him a second.
Wow.
Ross is saying to come fish the Farmington.
Yeah, okay, I'll come fish the Farmington like maybe tomorrow.
Do you want to see if they have any other questions?
Yeah, let's wait a minute and see if there are any other questions. I can answer questions about anything. Doesn't have to be about flies. If anybody has any questions, is there anybody listening out there? Maybe nobody's listening. Maybe this isn't being broadcast. That's very strange. Usually we have a lot of questions. Should I sing a song? No, I shouldn't sing a song.
Would you recommend dry or wet flies during rain?
Yes. I would recommend dry flies if the fish are rising, and I would recommend wet flies if they're not. How's that? And I'd even recommend a wet fly if they're rising because they may be feeding down below. But in the rain, I wouldn't fish a dry fly if I don't see any rises. I'll tell you that.
And what is your favorite? Matt wants to know what your favorite fly to use is.
I don't have a favorite fly. I don't have a favorite place to fish, and I don't have a favorite fly. I look in my box and figure it out when I get there.
Ben is asking why no monster articulated things like gallop streamers.
Well, this, I don't know about you, but this is pretty monster articulated. If you don't think that's not monster articulated, that's bigger than any of my tarpon flies. So that's as big as I'm going to go. That's monster, as far as I'm concerned. How long is that? Like 5.5, 6 inches?
Yeah, I think so. Ross is asking if you fish sculpins in the fall.
I fish sculpins all the time. Fish eat sculpins all year long. Yeah, and this is probably a pretty good imitation of a sculpin, the smaller fly. It's got that flat head. It's a little bit brighter than a sculpin, but with bait fish, you really don't need to match the hatch. You don't need to have a fly that looks exactly like a sculpin. If the fish is going to eat a sculpin, it's probably going to eat nearly anything else that looks interesting that gets in front of them. So I don't worry too much about exactly imitating sculpins. I have some flies that do exactly imitate sculpins, and they don't, in my experience, work any better than something like that.
Do you ever fish two streamers?
Yes, I do fish two streamers. It can be fun. It's hard to cast, two big streamers. I'll typically not fish two streamers unless I'm fishing from a drift boat, just because I think you need to cover a lot of water with streamers anyways, and a little bit easier to cast them from a drift boat when you're standing up high and just kind of lobbing than when you're waiting. So yeah, and it's kind of a good idea to. This is kind of kind of seems at cross purposes, but what I would do is I would put the little streamer first. Most people would put the big streamer first and then tie a piece of tippet on there and put the little streamer behind it. But it makes more sense to have the little streamer here and the big streamer so that it looks like a bigger fish chasing a smaller fish. Just looks a little bit more realistic. And it's a bear to cast, but two streamers can be fun. You can get some pretty interesting reactions from the fish, even if you don't hook any. When they start chasing a pair of streamers, it can be pretty exciting.
And Greg was asking, and it was when you were talking about the articulated monster, did you say these would work well in the Farmington in Connecticut and Deerfield in Mass?
I said they would work anywhere. Yes, they will. There's lots of other flies that will work too, but these will work there. Yeah, these will work in the Farmington or the Deerfield. Yep.
What weight rod for that D&D?
I have cast a D&D with a rod as light as a 4. I don't recommend it. Probably a 6, 5, 6, 7, depending on how comfortable you are casting big fly with a lighter rod. The key to fishing a big streamer like this is not to use a long tippet. Use a short, heavy tippet, like 4 feet or 20 pound. That'll make it cast easier on any rod. But depending on how comfortable you are with casting, a good caster could actually get this out with a 3-weight rod. It's not fun and not pretty. If you're a little bit less comfortable with your casting, then I'd go with a 7-weight rod because it's a big fly. It's bigger than a lot of saltwater flies. You could even fish it with an 8. 8's getting kind of overgunned for most trout, but people do it.
Dan just tuned in. Have you mentioned your go-to fall dries?
Yes, Dan. Go back and listen to this after it's over.
Ronnie's asking, what line and rod do you use for wet flies?
Ronnie is
Yes.
asking, what rod and line do I use for wet flies? I use whatever rod and line I happen to be using. Might be a 3 or a 4 or a 5, sometimes a 6. I don't use it. I don't feel you need a special rod for fishing wet flies because most people go back and forth between nymphs and dries and streamers all day long just trying different things, and I don't want to carry a second rod just to fish a particular kind of fly. So no, I use the same line, leader, tippet for at least for nymph fishing or wet fly fishing as I do for dry fly fishing. Streamers you go to a shorter, heavier leader, yes, but this stuff over here, the nymphs and the dries, would be the same.
Scott's asking, how effective are stone flies in the fall?
How effective are stone flies in the fall? Well, trout eat them. I don't. The stone flies I don't think are quite as active in the fall as the mayflies or the cat. You don't see many stone flies hatching in the fall. So they're not as available to the trout. They're not moving around as much on the bottom, and I have a feeling that they might be just kind of staying. Stoneflies might be just kind of staying out of the way in the fall. I'm sure they'll work, and I'm sure fish eat stonefly nymphs in the fall, but it wouldn't be in my top 8 or 10 flies.
Hugh's asking, how would you fish for trout during the transitioning from summer to fall?
How would I fish for trout during the transitioning between summer and fall? That's a good question. And I don't really have an answer because the transition could be really abrupt. You could all of a sudden get cold, rainy weather, water levels go up, water temperature drops. In that case, you're probably going to want to fish streamers or some bigger nymphs. Or the transition could be really mild, where you have mild windless days and insect hatches. So the transition varies. It really varies depending on where you are. And I wouldn't. I don't have a plan of attack in my mind usually until I hit the river. I have an idea of what I'd like to fish and what I hope to see, but sometimes you have to readjust when you get to the river and you see the conditions. So,
Steve's asking, can you explain how to effectively use a thermometer to determine hatches?
how to use a thermometer to determine hatches. I don't know of any way of determining hatches. I honestly don't. It's like figuring out where to find hen of the woods mushrooms in the fall. I have no idea how to determine hatches. You go to the river and you hope to see them. What a thermometer will tell you is that whether trout will be active or not, and whether insects will be a little bit more active or not. But to determine when a hatch is going to happen with a thermometer, I don't know how to do it. Never seen a good way of predicting hatches by thermometer. If you're below 45, 50 degrees, things are going to be slow. The bugs aren't going to be moving around that much or hatching, and the trout are going to be pretty logy in most streams. When you get between 50 and 65, trout are going to be really active. So are the insects. When you get to 70, 70 Fahrenheit, trout may still feed, but you want to stop fishing then because trout get really stressed at water temperatures over 70 degrees. So you just don't want to fish for trout, even though they may be feeding.
Ronnie's asking, streaking caddis, is it the best fly whatsoever?
Streaking caddis is the streaking caddis is absolutely the best fly ever. I have no idea what the streaking caddis is, but if you think it's the best fly ever, then it is.
Great. And I think that's the end of our questions.
That's the end of our questions.
I believe so.
Oh, wow, I'm getting off easy today. All right. Well, thank you all for listening today, all 10 of you. We'll be doing this again soon, and we're probably going to start a pretty more regular series of Facebook Live casts or productions or whatever we call them. What do we call them, Joel? Facebook Lives, starting next year in January. So, and we'll try to announce it ahead of time so that you can plan. So thanks for listening today, and see you soon.